G'day, I'm Phil Sarkis. I'm the Fire Hazard Reduction / Bush Regeneration team leader at Willoughby Council. I'm also the trainer of 8 bushcare groups, weekdays and weekends. And today I'd like to share with you how I introduced fire and post-fire care to the volunteers to use on their bushcare groups. I also am aware and recognise that a lot of people and the world have used fire in their own way for a long time. Alongside me is one of our bushcare volunteers, Jeff, and he will tell you his experience when fire was used on his bushcare site. After the 94 bushfires in Sydney, Willoughby Council put together a fire hazard reduction crew, and in 1995 I joined them. This was my first experience with using fire in the bush. I was instructed to collect sticks, branches, logs, or anything that could burn. I said to them, what, anything that would burn? They said, yep, and construct a ginormous bonfire and just light it. And there's one of our bonfires. That's about 15 foot high, that flame height. The end photo there, I still remember that was the day I realised we were just burning piles in the bush for little ecological or hazard reduction benefits. That's when I had a gut feeling that things had to change. So how did I change things? I said to everyone, why don't we spread the piles out? By doing this, we created a less intense fire over a larger area instead of burning the living daylights out of a tiny incy-bincy spot. And the result was, here we have one of those incy-wincy piles with little to none regen, and next to it is a smaller broad area burn where the piles were spread out into a small area burn. There's the pile. All these photos are about a year after each burn, and all we've got is a couple of weeds, and possibly there was 1 or 2 regen of native plants on the rim of the burn. The other one you can see, it was much of a higher recruitment and species diversity. So why did I decide to bring fire to bushcare? I noticed that some volunteers needed more. So I suggested to the bushcare coordinator, I know you're out there somewhere, that we offer fire to their bushcare sites. Wouldn't it be great if they could experience the process involved and take them through from start to finish? So one day I did. I'm going to read this to you because it's the only poetry I've ever written. Our burns are low and slow. Okay, what does that mean? Low refers to our flame height. The aerial fuels are cut to the ground, which keeps the flame height low. And slow is our lighting pattern, where we always light at the top of the site. Always light at the top of the site and let the fire crawl down the hill, never relighting behind the fire front. This allows everything from invertebrates to the largest animals to escape and seek refuge. By burning this way, our fire is controlled and our canopy is left unharmed. That's the day after this burn. You can see all the canopy, nice and green and unharmed. That one, that's another burn. That's about a week after that burn, all the canopy green and unharmed. A few months before the burn, we prepare the site. Here's an example of the site unprepared and prepared. So all those fine fuels you can see over there are now on the ground. Here's another before and after of a bushcare group working away under the instruction of the trainer. There's the trainer there. Cutting, again, all the fine fuels and anything reasonably thin, usually around not much thicker than my thumb. The tools they're using are only secateurs, loppers, tiny mini saws, medium hand saws and poles, large pole saws, usually chainsaw poles. I'd like to say here too, we don't discriminate. We burn pristine bush all the way to the most degraded bush you can get. That's me there a few months later. I'm going through checking the seasoning of the fuel to see if we're ready to burn. Not all sites are the same. Here we have a small area within a burn where a raft was constructed and many materials that need to sit up off the ground to season properly are able to season without rotting. Now, usually they're weeds, and that's any type of weed you can think of, except for annuals. There's an example of fishbone fern being used. An interesting story with these rafts. One day I overheard a bushcare volunteer talk about how she used to run into the bush and play in the dinosaur nests. Used to run up from the soccer fields with her friends and play in the dinosaur nests for hours. And these were our rafts. I found as I introduced fire to the volunteers and started to take them through the process, the questions never stopped. They continued right up until the day of the burn and well into post-fire care. And I got a great kick out of answering hundreds of questions that you'd never think of. Here's another bushcare group. Not everyone is familiar or safe or like fire around their beautiful home. One day I suggested to this group one morning that we use fire on their site for beneficial reasons. I had the crowd around me, and as I was explaining how we're going to do it and why it should be used, the murmurs started, the heads turned, the eyes rolled, and when I wasn't expected, from the back gallery, "No way you're going to burn my bushcare site to the ground." Well, I've never seen that before. But now I'll hand you over to Jeff, and he can tell you more experience from a volunteer's perspective.
Thank you, Phil. So, I have only recently come to bushcare, working with Phil and his amazing team of bushcare staff at Willoughby Council. Trin and Monique, big shout out to both of you here today. I've come to bushcare not as someone of the usual, I'm getting older, I'm finding other interesting things to do in my life. I was brought to bushcare by my daughter, who will feature through this talk quite a bit and perhaps should be here instead of myself. So She began bushcare by contacting Monique. She dragged my wife into it. For a couple of years I held out, feeling that the Saturday morning jobs were more important, but eventually folded, and it's been a very rewarding part of my life. So this is myself on the bushcare site that we've been responsible for in the Castle Cove area of Willoughby Council in Sydney, right smack bang in the middle of expensive housing. And this is a site that was originally very heavily degraded. It was largely lawn with perhaps a couple of remnant trees, and over a period of many, many years, it has been restored. And the burning process that's been used on this site was applied really to extend the site fairly substantially by about a third to grow the area that was being cared for and brought back from that heavily degraded state. But this is an approach that's been used on much larger areas within the council, and you can see in the middle photo up here that that's one of those much larger areas where burning has been applied. So one of the things that features heavily throughout the bushcare process that's applied by Willoughby Council on these sites is a strong emphasis on observation of really healthy bushland in the local area, drawing upon that deep understanding of what it looks like to be healthy and functional as an area of bushland in the Willoughby Council region, and then taking those lessons to bushcare in these more degraded areas that need some intervention. And so that process can be really demanding for volunteers because the area of bushland is very extensive, the number of volunteers are still relatively small. So how do you manage that balance without getting volunteers to become quite depressed about the effort required to make the changes that we're looking to achieve? And these rafts that you can see in this slide are a key part of that. They're a part of this process of trying to have an intervention that's minimalist in terms of the effort required from the volunteer workforce. And burning is a very core part of this. It's perhaps, I was going to use an analogy of judo where it's a martial art and you're trying to use nature's momentum to achieve the outcomes you're after, but I don't want to characterise this as a conflict. Think of it perhaps more as a dance where you're trying to read your partner, work with your partner to land things in the right place. And a burn is a really substantial intervention. Perhaps it could be one of those signature moments in a dance where you lift your partner, and I don't know which partner is being lifted, but it is a very carefully judged part of that interaction between the volunteers who are doing the bushcare and the site itself. So you can see here, this is a team on your left-hand side. This is actually a team from our bushcare site, and the person who went and played in the dinosaur nests, as it were, is with her back to you. That's my daughter, and I was the football coach who had no team because they were being dragged off to these dinosaur nests to play amongst the rafts. So it was very entertaining for me to see her now back involved in the construction of these rafts that have a very fundamental part to play in the way in which the burns are facilitated. So as volunteers, we're involved in this whole bushcare process leading from pre-burn through to the burn itself and then the post-burn care. And these rafts give us a way of being able to prepare facilities, importantly keeping things off the ground. We had several months, I think, where it was very, very wet in Sydney leading up to the burn, and I remember Phil regularly inspecting the site, looking to see whether the conditions were right, whether the fuel load was in an appropriate state for then spreading over the site and using as the basis for this low and slow burn. So that is the burn day itself, and you can see me right in the background, perhaps in the haze of smoke. This burn's happening between two quite expensive houses in the middle of Castle Cove. I was there to witness most of the burn going on, and the neighbours didn't even come out to inspect what was going on next door because the impact of this fire was so minimal. It was low, it was slow, as Phil said, and it just didn't pose a threat given the team that was on site to manage the risks around that. As volunteers, we weren't permitted to actually get involved in the lighting of fires or the control of fires ourselves, but that was a relief to myself and probably to Phil. The consequences of that burn you can see here. So this is straight after that burn on the same site. You can see the same fence in the background. You can see the state of the canopy over that burn, and you can see the consequences in terms of what's been revealed. What's most important to me out of that photo is the lovely bush rock that was exposed through this process. Bush rock we didn't even realise was on the site, and I'm fairly confident there's a red-bellied black snake sleeping or hibernating under some of those rocks at the moment. Some months later, the site had transformed drastically, and for a lot of volunteers this is a really intimidating experience to see the waves of weeds regenerating out of the soil, recolonising the site. It's really important to recognise the importance of this regeneration process. As those weeds recolonised the site, they provided protection for the seedlings that we were interested in keeping on site, the local species that were also regenerating. They provided habitat for the insect life and the invertebrate life. As they got more mature and we removed them, the disturbance in the soil that removal process caused, let me go back, I'm jumping slides. That disturbance process again triggered further germination of the seed bank that we were looking to have develop on the site. So it was very concerning to see these weeds develop in the first few months after the burn had happened, and now we're 18 months down the track and we've seen different species of weeds come and go on the site, and we've seen the regeneration of local species developing in the area in ways that are really gratifying. So I want to finish by just flagging the consequences of this type of intervention on site in terms of the biodiversity. Here we can see probably one of the most charismatic species that come through the area. There's a grove of Banksia trees on site now that have regenerated from the seed bank of a Banksia that was there well before any of this bush care began and had since died. That's a member of a flock that now visits very regularly, inspects the site and feeds, and is active in its own management of the way this area develops. And on the far right, so I've been so delighted to see people referring to iNaturalist all the time. I'm a massive fan of the iNaturalist community, and that is an iNaturalist image of our bushcare site. You can see it's smack bang in the middle of this urban area and heavily populated with observations from birds, mammals, invertebrates, what have you. Most excitingly, last weekend, while we were on site, everyone was sitting there weeding away, Phil shouted out that he'd seen a wallaby, a swamp wallaby, come down across Boundary Road, through the bushcare site, onto Deepwater Road, which is a heavily urbanised environment, and feeling confident enough to move through that area. At some risk to itself, I'd have to emphasise, given the talk about bandicoots earlier this morning, but at least these species are present in the area and looking for some kind of refuge that we're in the process of being able to provide. So you can also see a lorikeet looking to nest here, and a termite mound that's actually grown up on one of the stumps that's been left in situation on the site as part of minimising the work of volunteers trying to manage this, and kookaburras are now beginning to nest in that termite nest this season. So there's an enormous payoff to the biodiversity, the environment that we're being able to provide. That means a lot to myself as a volunteer, but also my wife and I have been involved very heavily in wildlife care, basically providing a second chance for wildlife that's found itself unable to cope in an urban environment. And so often, the effort that you'd go to as a wildlife carer would not pay off. You'd end up having to euthanize whatever animal it was had found itself in trouble. And it's much better to be able to provide this sort of preventative healthcare or treatment by providing an environment that gives space to the wildlife to live alongside us. So being able to participate in this as a volunteer is incredibly rewarding. One last thing to say from a volunteer's perspective is that through the COVID period, where there were so tight lockdowns, Sydney not perhaps as bad as other parts of Australia, but there were significant lockdowns, and through that period being able to get on site in a fairly safe space and be able to act in a way that was safe for ourselves and safe for our community and engage with this lot under the guidance of Trin and Phil was an incredible part of keeping good healthcare, good mental health care for my wife and myself through that whole COVID lockdown period. So I cannot emphasise enough how much that payoff to the volunteers has mattered, and it's continued on today. So we really get a lot of benefit out of that experience each month as we get back on site. Over to you, Phil, for any questions.
Thank you very much.